Among the most formidable diesel locomotives ever produced, the legacy of the Class 55 Deltics, despite their small numbers, is one that has resonated across British railway history, proving in their brief careers that diesel and electric locomotives were not simply bland machines when compared to the steam engines they replaced, and introduced a new era of speed to the East Coast Mainline. The story of the Deltic locomotives begins with the power units from which their nicknames are derived, the Napier Deltic opposed-piston two-stroke diesel engines, a power plant originally developed for the Admiralty in 1943 during the height of World War II, following the discussions of a committee tasked with creating an improved high-power lightweight diesel engine for the torpedo boats of the Royal Navy. This unit would replace the previous petrol-driven engines that were notorious for their inflammable nature, a daunting prospect for vessels which were expected to operate while under enemy fire, diesel power being chosen due to its highly successful use by the E-boats of Nazi Germany, but had been largely avoided to that point by the Royal Navy due to the archaic nature of technology at the time. While poor power-to-weight ratios and low speed had been endemic among British power plants, the Napier Company, in a pre-war agreement with Junkers of Germany, had been working on an opposed-piston two-stroke design based on the Junkers UMO 204 power plant called the Culverin, this configuration being designed around the cylinder having a single piston and being closed at one end with a cylinder head. The UMO-based design used an elongated cylinder containing two pistons moving in opposite directions towards the center, which obviates the need for a heavy cylinder head, as the opposing piston filled this role, and though the proposed power plant was too late for use in World War II, the first unit, dubbed the Deltic D18-11B, began development in 1947 and was unveiled in 1950 with a power output of 2,500 horsepower. 6 units would be made available by January 1952, which were tested aboard captured German E-boats, the Deltic power plants illustrating significant size and weight reductions against the Mercedes-Benz diesels originally fitted, while still presenting the same general performance, the success of these trials leading to their inclusion in the Dark-class fast attack boat of 1954, of which 26 units were delivered. This was followed by their inclusion aboard the Yeld-class or Nasty-class patrol craft, which saw action in the Vietnam War on the side of the US Navy, wherein they specialized in river warfare, 20 units of which were completed and saw action with the American Armed Forces between 1962 and 1981. For the use of the Deltic power plants in a railway capacity, this was owed to the British Railways Modernisation Plan of 1955, which required that the aging steam locomotives of the early BR era and pre-war railway companies be replaced on a like-for-like basis by diesel and electric traction of equivalent or improved power outputs. This would result in the development of dozens of classes of locomotive with up to 100 members of their respective fleets, which were employed on a wide variety of tasks ranging from top-line passenger expresses to short-range trip freight workings. The potential for using Deltic power plants in mainline railway service was the brainchild of Napier chairman Sir George Nelson and his son, also named George Nelson, who believed that, based on the incredible success of the engines in naval service, these power units could provide a major improvement over contemporary diesel units currently being introduced with early locomotives, as well as gas turbine alternatives. Napier, therefore, was able to develop a rail-based version of the engine thanks to its parent company English Electric, who had acquired the firm in 1942 under orders of the Ministry of Aircraft Production, with 1954 seeing a demonstration unit, which had been downsized for use within the dimensions of a contemporary locomotive, be produced by the Dick Kerr Company, an engine manufacturer which had been purchased by English Electric in 1919 at their Preston works. Seeing that a fully functional engine could be delivered for use on the railway, a prototype locomotive was constructed for the Deltic power plant, this machine originally to be christened the name Enterprise, but following the use of this moniker on a range of small diesel mechanical locomotives built by Hudswell Clark, English Electric simply allocated the name Deltic, although its official designation was DP1, or Development Prototype Number 1. Fitted with 2 D-rated Napier Deltic engines, which had been reduced in physical size and power output, the combined performance of these 2 power units was 3,300 horsepower, making DP1 the first diesel locomotive capable of operating at a sustained 100 miles an hour in the UK, while the general styling of the machine adopted an American aesthetic, with bonnets and a large single cab light which resembled the likes of the EMD E8 and Alco PA. Released from the Preston Works in 1955, DP1 was not originally associated with the Eastern region, instead starting its life on the London Midland region, working fast freight trains between London and Liverpool, whereupon it was withdrawn at the end of the same year for modifications, returning to work on passenger trains up and down the Settle and Carlisle line in northern England. Its passenger operations would eventually extend to the entire length of the Midland Mainline route out of London St Pancras to Carlisle via Derby and Sheffield, before moving back to the West Coast Mainline on express trains between London Euston and Liverpool Lime Street. While it seemed that the Deltic design was to be the mainstay of services on the West Coast Mainline, Chief Mechanical and Electrical Engineer of the London Midland region, J.F. Harrison, rejected the use of the 3,300 horsepower locomotive, believing that engines with a power output of more than 1,500 RPM were unsuited for use on the railway. This would leave DP1 without a line on which to serve, although its bleak prospects were thankfully short-lived, as line traffic manager of the former Great Northern Main Line out of London King's Cross, Gary Vines, noted the potential of this high-speed locomotive in replacing the aging Pacifics of the former LNER, specifically the Gresley A4 Pacifics, which had been the backbone of express trains for the past 20 years. While a variety of new diesel locomotives were coming online during 1957, including the 2,000 horsepower English Electric Type 4, later designated Class 40, Vines demanded an engine with a higher output in order to provide a notable improvement in journey times over the outgoing steam equivalents, while proposals to electrify the route in the same manner as the West Coast Main Line were stymied by the cost of modifying the roof at King's Cross Station. Therefore, DP1 entered service on top-line express diagrams along the East Coast Main Line during 1957, but the machine would have a relatively short lifespan, being taken out of service in March 1961 after suffering a major engine failure. But during its 6 years of trials, it had notched up an impressive 450,000 miles on both the London Midland and Eastern regions. Through its superb performance, DP1 would pave the way for an order of 22 Type 5 production locomotives in 1959, which would replace 55 equivalent steam engines, and revolutionise top expresses between London, Peterborough, Leeds, York, Newcastle and Edinburgh, although various changes in the outward design between DP1 and the production Deltics needed to be made due to the former's excessive external dimensions. DP1 had been known to dislodge platform edgings at Newcastle, in addition to losing its cab steps after striking the platform at Darlington, and thus the size of the upcoming English Electric Type 5s would be trimmed down to make them more appropriate for the British loading gauge. The production Deltics, which were the only modernisation plan-era locomotives to fall under the Type 5 category of power output, were assembled at the English Electric Vulcan foundry near Newton-le-Willows, and under a contract with British Railways as part of their purchase, the builder would be responsible for their maintenance due to the complex and non-standard nature of the Napier engines and generators. English Electric itself, meanwhile, would ensure that a surplus of Deltic power plants were available for rapid insertion into locomotives during major overhauls, so as to make sure they were out of mainline service for as short a period as possible, the engines being allocated to 3 depots as part of their distribution on East Coast Mainline expresses. Finsbury Park outside London King's Cross, Gateshead near Newcastle, and Haymarket in Edinburgh would all receive a number of Deltics, which, unlike DP1, were outshopped in a variation of the British Railways two-tone green livery, which included cream cab window surrounds, and upon their completion, every one of the 22 locomotives was christened a name, depending on which of the 3 depots they had been allocated to. The 6 Gateshead and 8 Haymarket examples would adopt the names of British Army regiments, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, the Prince of Wales' Own Regiment of Yorkshire, the Durham Light Infantry, Royal Scots Grey, and the Black Watch being among the various monikers chosen for these locomotives. For the 8 remaining Finsbury Park Deltics, these would continue a naming convention carried over from the LNER by adopting the titles of thoroughbred racehorses, including St Paddy, Meld, Pinzer, Alicedon, Crapello, Tullia, Ballymoss and Nimbus. Despite not being the first production Deltic to be built, the second unit, D9001 St Paddy, had the distinction of being the first of the class to enter service with British Railways on February 23, 1961, and throughout the remainder of the year and into 1962, the subsequent 22-strong fleet of locomotives were built and entered operation on the East Coast Main Line. Their superb performance would not only be illustrated against Gresley's charismatic A4 Pacifics, but also the incredibly heavy and severely underpowered English Electric Type 4s, the Deltics being capable of completing the premier King's Cross to Edinburgh run in 5 hours and 55 minutes, bringing the two cities, for the first time, to within less than 6 hours of each other. Distribution of the Deltics was completed by the end of 1962, during which time the class had taken over operation of the venerable Flying Scotsman Express from the Type 4s, their distinctive styling and two-tone green livery being a staple of BR's advertising during the early 1960s, while Gresley's A4s, after 30 years as flagships of the East Coast Mainline, were eventually forced north away from their King's Cross home. In addition to the regular Type 5 Deltics, further applications for the Napier power units in a railway capacity were considered, including the Class 51 Super Deltic, an enhanced version of the type which intended the fitting of two supercharged Deltic 18-cylinder engines, producing between 4,000 and 4,600 horsepower, into a modified version of the Class 50 body shell. This machine would have been 2 meters longer than the regular Class 50 to accommodate the twin power units, and although British Rail were prepared to place an order for these 125-mile-an-hour locomotives, their focus turned instead to the Advanced Passenger Train or APT Tilting Train project, and thus the Super Deltic scheme never went beyond the concept stage. One version that did successfully make it into production, though, and did in fact precede the Type 5 Deltics themselves, was a downsized version of the regular Deltics which fell into the Type 2 power output classification, this later being designated the Class 23 and was affectionately dubbed the Baby Deltic. The Baby Deltic differed from the Type 5 through the use of a single Deltic T929 power unit, which was physically smaller and produced 1,100 horsepower, the intentions of the Baby Deltic being to provide an alternative Type 2 class of engine under the modernisation plan against the proposals being made by the North British Locomotive Company and British Railway's own Derby Works. Put to work on semi-fast outer suburban trains from King's Cross, the Class 23s were not successful machines, the downsizing of the Napier power units to create the T929 giving rise to persistent crankshaft seizures, while issues regarding the locomotive's weight meant its ability to be used on many parts of the network was limited, causing BR to refuse acceptance of the type upon its completion in 1959. Although 10 examples were eventually built, by 1962 only 4 remained in service due to various reliability problems, until the last examples were withdrawn for major modifications the following year, the Baby Deltics being returned to work between 1964 and 1965 on a mixture of freight and passenger diagrams, although their small numbers and non-standard nature meant they were condemned for scrap between 1968 and 1971. While the final example, D5901, was eventually cut up in 1977, one T929 power unit was preserved, this having been stored at Stratford Depot in East London in order to provide a spares donor for D5901 during its final years, this unit being later transferred to the National Railway Museum in York, and is currently being fitted into a replica Class 23, utilising the body shell of Class 37 372. Back with the regular Type 5 Deltics, their ability to provide 100-mile-an-hour expresses up and down the East Coast Mainline was one of the few successes of the modernisation plan era, and with various upgrades to the main line, including a comprehensive rebuilding of a previous bottleneck at Peterborough Station in 1972, services between London and Edinburgh could achieve a journey time of 5 hours and 27 minutes. On February 2, 1978, 55008 the Greens Howard achieved a record-breaking run between York and King's Cross by completing the journey in 2 hours and 17 minutes, with an average speed of 97 miles an hour and a top speed of 125 miles an hour being reached while descending Stoke Bank. The Deltics, later designated Class 55s, were also among the first express passenger locomotives to have their steam heating boilers replaced by electric train heating or ETH, as the original Mark I rolling stock was replaced by Mark II carriages from around 1970. But despite their huge improvements, the unique and complicated mechanics of the Deltics were ones which caused major headaches within the BR management. Going into the 1970s, British Rail, as a means to save the cost of maintaining small numbers of non-standard classes, demanded a more universal form of rolling stock be introduced. The Deltics, after the withdrawal of the Class 52 Westerns on the main line out of London Paddington, being the last non-standard mainline diesel-electric locomotives in use with British Rail. Furthermore, the Deltics were not immune to accidents, suffering 4 incidents during their working lives, although none were ever written off as a result of damage, the first accident being on December 15, 1961, when D9012 Crapello, hauling an empty stock train, collided with the rear of a goods train at Connington during permissive block working, with the wreckage later being hit by another passing goods train. On March 5, 1967, D9004 Queen's Own Highlander was hauling a passenger train that overran a signal and derailed once again at Connington, leading to the deaths of 5 people, the cause being due to the signalman having moved a set of points under the train, thus leading to his conviction of endangering persons travelling on the railway and was sentenced to 2 years, though he was later acquitted of manslaughter. On May 7, 1969, D9011 the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, hauling the northbound Aberdonian, derailed at Morpeth in Northumberland due to excessive speed on a curve, and although the Deltic itself remained on the tracks, the coaches tipped over on the sharp corner through the station and piled up at the side of the railway, killing 6 people and injuring 46. The final incident involving the Deltics took place on February 16, 1977, when an express hauled by 55008 the Greens Howard collided with a Class 101 unit operating an empty stock train after failing to stop at Darlington, the cause of the accident being due to the brakes on the carriages having become isolated due to debris on the track striking the handle of the brake isolating cock. In 1972, testing for a potential replacement came in the form of the prototype high-speed train, or HST, a train set comprising 2 power cars and 8 brand-new Mark III coaches that was capable of achieving 125 miles an hour in service, and following a series of successful tests on both the East Coast and Great Western Main lines, a production series of Intercity 125 sets were delivered from 1976. While the HSTs initially entered service on trains out of London Paddington to Bristol, Cardiff and the West Country, the East Coast Main Line would see their first allocations of HST sets from 1977, with these new express sets rapidly superseding the Deltics on top-line expresses, with the famous Flying Scotsman becoming HST hauled from May 1978. In the face of locomotive-hauled expresses being replaced by HSTs, and in so doing rendering the few remaining locomotive maintenance sheds at Finsbury Park, Gateshead and Haymarket surplus to requirement, Finsbury Park opted to reignite enthusiasm among its staff in 1979 by painting their 8 Class 55s with striking white-cap window surrounds, making them a favourite among the Deltic fleet. This move, sadly, did not prolong their inevitable withdrawal, and in 1980 the first examples, 55001 St Paddy, 55003 Meld, and 55020 Nimbus, were officially withdrawn, although they had been out of service for nearly 2 years and heavily stripped as spares donors, while the remaining 5 Finsbury Park-based engines were reallocated to York prior to full closure of the Finsbury Park depot in 1983. Throughout 1981, the general rule among BR staff was to give the class only basic maintenance and to demote them to secondary and low-priority services, including parcels trains, some daytime passenger services and overnight sleepers, while due to a lack of special attention to their Napier power plants, this would become the root cause of locomotive failures that would ultimately lead to their official withdrawal. With unserviceable classmates being cannibalized for parts to keep surviving units going, these would eventually be dragged to the scrap lines at Doncaster and Stratford Works for parting out, once they had been reduced to empty shells, leaving, at the start of 1982, only 3 Class 55s officially still in service with British Rail. The final regular passenger service hauled by a Deltic took place on December 31, 1981, with the 1630 Aberdeen to York powered by 55019 Royal Highland Fusilier, while on January 2, 1982, a Deltic farewell special dubbed the Deltic Scotsman Farewell undertook one final out-and-back journey from London King's Cross to Edinburgh. This farewell tour would be powered northbound by 55015 Tullya and on the return by Class Premier 55022 Royal Scots Grey, while 55009 Elizabeth shadowed the train in both directions in order to provide rescue in the event either Tullya or Royal Scots Grey suffered a breakdown. With this, the curtain had fallen on the era of the Deltics for the East Coast Mainline, and following the official end of Class 55 service with BR, the survivors were gathered at Doncaster Works for a final public display before being sent for scrapping, although even long before the retirement of the fleet, several locomotives had been allocated for preservation. One of these was 55002, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, which had been selected for preservation by the National Railway Museum in York, and was the first preserved Deltic to run on the main line when it worked light engine to York after participating in the Doncaster Works Open Day on February 27, 1982. Amid the scrappage of Deltics at Doncaster and Stratford, 6 complete units, together with 2 cabs and the prototype DP1, have been preserved in varying degrees of intactness: D9000 Royal Scots Grey, D9002 the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, D9009 Ellisodon, D9015 Tullier, D9016 Gordon Highlander, and D9019 Royal Highland Fusilier, while the cabs of D9008 the Greens Howard and D9021 Argyll and Sutherland Highlander are also on display. For the prototype, after its withdrawal from BR service in 1961, proposals were made to ship the locomotive to Canada for further trials, although this scheme never materialised, and it was instead preserved at the Science Museum in London from April 1963 to October 1993, whereupon it was sent to the National Railway Museum at York and in July 2004 to the NRM's Shildon Museum in County Durham. The locomotive, though, has also ventured back to its original birthplace of Preston in Lancashire, and was put on display at the Ribble Steam Railway in Preston Docks between August 2012 and October 2015, before returning back to Shildon. For the production Deltics, a long and turbulent effort was made to see at least one of these locomotives be returned to mainline certification, the focus being on Class Premier D9000 Royal Scots Grey, which had been preserved at the Nene Valley Railway after its withdrawal in 1982. Following a lengthy overhaul and exhaustive certification process, the locomotive's first run on the main line in preservation took place on November 30, 1996, working the Deltic Deliverance Tour between Edinburgh and King's Cross, although this tour was cut short after only 56 miles due to an exhaust stack fire at Berwick-upon-Tweed, resulting in the locomotive being removed and dragged back to its Glasgow base for repair. The true return of D9000 onto the main line was the Deltic Reunion Tour of January 2, 1997, occurring 15 years to the day since the last Deltic ran in official BR service, this tour operating between King's Cross, Hull and Harrogate via York without incident, and thereby paved the way for other Deltic locomotives to return to mainline operations. Work on the mainline system, aside from rail tours, has also included revenue-earning duties and ad hoc departmental use, as has been exhibited by D9000 when it was hired by GB Rail Freight to haul bauxite tankers between North Blythe and the Linemouth aluminium smelter during April 2011, followed by its employment between May 2013 and November 2015, again by GBRF, in hauling ScotRail Class 334 EMUs for refurbishment at Kilmarnock. As of 2024, D9000 Royal Scots Grey and D9019 Royal Highland Fusilier are currently operational, while other locomotives are currently under repair or overhaul, the goal being to see more of these engines returning to mainline operation in order to work both rail tours and for potential revenue work with the various rail freight and departmental operators of the UK mainline network. To summarise, the Class 55 Deltics were an incredible series of machines that provided superb power and performance for over 20 years on the East Coast Mainline, and while their service careers were comparatively short, thanks to their largely non-standard nature and complicated mechanics, this was by no means a slight on their ability to power the toughest loads. Even in preservation, the incredible flexibility of these strong and sturdy engines has ensured their continued use on both freight, passenger and departmental work, as well as a place in the hearts of enthusiasts of all ages.